The moment Dorothy Pritchard stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the blazing summer of 1879, the dust rose around her boots like the town itself was trying to swallow her whole, and she had the distinct, unsettling feeling that she had made a terrible mistake. She stood on the sun-baked Main Street with a single leather trunk, a carpet-bag clutched against her ribs, and a letter of employment from a man named Gerald Hatch who ran the town's only schoolhouse. Gerald Hatch, it turned out, had died of a fever 3 weeks prior. Nobody had thought to write and tell her. Nobody, apparently, had thought to do much of anything in the time since, because the schoolhouse door was padlocked and the windows were thick with grime, and the children of Caldwell were running wild through the streets like a pack of small, sun-darkened animals, with no one to account for them. Dorothy was 24 years old, slim-shouldered and brown-haired, with serious gray eyes that had always made people think she was older than she was. She had come from Springfield, Illinois, where her father had recently passed and left her nothing but a modest education, a stubborn streak the width of the Missouri River, and a very clear understanding that she could not survive another Illinois winter on schoolteacher wages that no longer existed. She had answered Gerald Hatch's advertisement in the Springfield Courier because it had offered a salary, a small cottage behind the schoolhouse, and a fresh start. 2 of those 3 things now appeared to be in serious jeopardy. She picked up her trunk, carried it to the shade of the general store's porch, and stood there surveying the street. Caldwell was a cattle town, a stop along the Kishom Trail, and it showed. The smell of livestock was everywhere, a heavy, living smell that clung to the air and mixed with wood smoke and horse, and the particular sharp edge of summer heat on dry earth. Cowboys moved through the street in their dusty clothes and wide-brimmed hats, some heading toward the saloon at the far end, some leading horses, some doing nothing much at all except existing in that loose-limbed way men had when they were between hard pieces of work. Dorothy squared her shoulders and walked into the general store. The man behind the counter was named Walt Briggs, a wide man with a gray mustache and the kind of permanently resigned expression that comes from spending too many years watching other people's troubles walk through your door. He confirmed that Gerald Hatch was indeed dead, that the town council had not yet appointed a new schoolteacher, and that the cottage behind the schoolhouse was, technically, still the property of the school board, which meant Dorothy had nowhere obvious to sleep that night. "You might try the boarding house on Elm," Walt said. "Mrs. Calloway takes in women alone, $2 a week." "Thank you," Dorothy said, because she was always polite even when her situation was entirely falling apart. She bought a tin of crackers, a small wedge of cheese, and a newspaper, and she went back out into the sun to think. She was sitting on the edge of the general store porch, reading through the Caldwell newspaper with focused intensity because reading helped her think and because she was trying very hard not to feel sorry for herself, when the shadow fell over her. She looked up. The man standing there was tall, broad across the shoulders in a way that was functional rather than self-conscious, wearing a faded blue shirt and a canvas duster that had seen considerable weather. His hat was brown, the brim bent down on one side from long habit. He had dark eyes, the color of good river-bottom soil, and a jaw that was currently holding several days of dark stubble. He looked to be somewhere in his late 20s, maybe 30, and he had the particular stillness of someone who had learned that moving slowly in difficult situations was usually the wisest choice. He was looking at her trunk and then at her with an expression that held some curiosity and no impertinence. "You just came in on the stage," he said. "It was not a question." "I did," Dorothy said. "You're the new school teacher." "I was supposed to be," she said, "except the man who hired me is dead." The man was quiet for a moment. He pulled his hat off and ran a hand through dark hair that was thick and a little too long, the way it gets when a man has been out on the trail and not given much thought to barbershops. "That's a hard welcome," he said. "It is," Dorothy agreed. He put his hat back on. "Marshall Rourke," he said, extending a hand. "I work the Dunbar spread about 6 miles south." She shook it. His hand was rough and warm and very solid. "Dorothy Pritchard." I am apparently between occupations." Something shifted in his expression that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. "You planning to stay or planning to go back?" Dorothy looked at him steadily. "I haven't decided yet. I tend to make better decisions after I've eaten something." That did make him smile, brief and genuine. "Walt got crackers and cheese in there," he said, nodding toward the store. "It's not much, but it'll keep you thinking." "I already bought some," she said, lifting the paper bag slightly. He looked at her for another moment, a look that was assessing in the most honest, unguarded way, as though he was simply trying to understand what he was looking at and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Then he nodded once, touched the brim of his hat, and walked on down the street toward the livery. Dorothy watched him go. Then she opened her crackers and started eating and thought very carefully about what to do next. What she did next was walk to the school board, which operated out of the back room of the barber shop, apparently, and speak directly to a round-faced man named Aldous Fenn, who was the current chairman. She told Aldous Fenn that she had a signed letter of employment, that she had traveled 400 miles to honor it, and that she expected the town of Caldwell to honor it in return. She said this pleasantly, but in a tone that suggested she was not going to be moved by anything short of an earthquake. Aldous Fenn sweated a great deal and made several noises that were not quite words, and by the end of the conversation, he had agreed to let her open the schoolhouse on Monday, restore the cottage as her residence by the following morning, and pay her the agreed wage of $40 per month while the board assessed the situation. Dorothy thanked him politely and left before he had time to reconsider. The cottage was small and smelled like damp plaster and mouse, but it had a bed, a table, 2 chairs, a cast iron stove, and a window that looked out over a small yard where nothing was currently growing. Dorothy unpacked her trunk that evening by the light of a single oil lamp, and when she was done, she sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands flat against her thighs and breast until the tightness in her chest loosened enough that she felt like herself again. Her father had told her, in the last coherent conversation they'd had before the fever took him, that she was the most capable person he had ever met, and that he was sorry the world kept making her prove it. Dorothy had cried exactly once after that conversation, and then she had gotten up and figured out what needed to be done. She got up now and started figuring out what needed to be done. By Sunday evening, she had cleaned the schoolhouse from top to bottom, organized the scattered books that were stacked in haphazard piles against the walls, repaired a desk with a loose leg, using a nail she found in the yard and a rock as a hammer, and introduced herself to 4 families on the east side of town, whose children she had identified as school-aged based on the demographics of the children she'd seen running through the street. 3 of the 4 families had agreed to send their children Monday. The 4th family's mother had looked at Dorothy with narrow eyes and said she didn't see much use in schooling girls past arithmetic, and Dorothy had said, very pleasantly, that she hoped the woman would reconsider, and had left her door with a feeling in her stomach like a banked coal. She was coming back down the main street in the blue hour of Sunday evening when she nearly walked into Marshall Rourke, who was coming out of the hardware store with a coil of rope over one shoulder. He caught her by the elbow to keep her from stumbling, reflexively and without making anything of it. "School teacher," he said, releasing her immediately. "Mr. Rourke," she said. "You're in town late for a Sunday." "Needed rope," he said, which was simple and entirely sufficient as an explanation. He looked at her. "You're still here." "I'm still here," she confirmed. "I spoke to the school board yesterday. I start Monday." Something in his expression shifted again, that not-quite-smile quality. "Fenn gave you the job." "Fenn acknowledged that the job was already mine," she said. Marshall Rourke looked at her for a long moment in the fading light, and then he did smile, fully this time, and it changed his face entirely. It made him look younger and less weathered, made the dark eyes warm in a way that was startlingly direct. "I'll be damned," he said, with what appeared to be genuine admiration. "Probably not for that reason," Dorothy said and walked on. She heard him laugh behind her, low and surprised, and she allowed herself a small smile of her own once she had turned the corner. Monday came and 17 children appeared at the schoolhouse door, ranging in age from 6 to 14, and Dorothy taught them all day with the systematic intensity of someone who has missed having purpose. She sorted them by reading level, not age, which caused some indignation among the older ones who found themselves sitting beside 6-year-olds. But she explained with patient clarity that there was no shame in being where you were, only in refusing to move forward from there. By the end of the day, she had 3 children in tears, 2 who had decided she was their favorite person alive, and one 14-year-old boy named Eli Dobbs, who was smarter than anyone had apparently noticed, and who looked at the arithmetic problems she gave him with the startled expression of someone hearing music for the first time. She walked home that evening tired in a clean, satisfying way, the kind of tired that comes from work that matters. The sun was going down in spectacular fashion over the flat Kansas landscape, painting the sky in layers of orange and violet and deep rose, and Dorothy stood in the yard behind the cottage for a few minutes just watching it because it was one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen, and she was not going to walk past beautiful things without acknowledging them, no matter how tired she was. She heard a horse, and then Marshall Rourke came around the side of the schoolhouse on a bay mare, moving at a walk. He pulled up when he saw her. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said. "You didn't," she said. "Were you coming to the school?" "Cutting through from the Dobbs place," he said. "Their fence line runs up against the schoolyard. I do some work for them from time to time." He looked at the sunset, then at her. "First day go all right." "It went very well," she said. "I think the Dobbs boy might be exceptional." Something moved across Marshall's face. "Eli, do you know him?" "A bit," he said. He dismounted and stood beside his horse, not as though he was planning to stay long, just as though he was a man who found it easier to be at rest on the ground than above it. "His father doesn't think much of school." "His father mentioned that when I knocked on their door," Dorothy said. "I gathered he only sent Eli because his wife insisted." "That's probably right." Marshall turned his hat in his hands. "Clara Dobbs is a good woman, smarter than the county gives her credit for." Dorothy looked at him. "You seem to know the people here well." "Been working this area for 5 years," he said. "You get to know people. Where were you before?" He was quiet for a moment, and she noticed that he was the kind of man who did not fill silences just to fill them, who actually thought about answers before he gave them. "Texas," he said. "Before that, further south. I moved around a fair bit." "What made you stop moving?" she asked. He looked at the sunset. "Found work I was good at," he said, "and a piece of country that didn't make me feel like I needed to be somewhere else." Dorothy nodded. She understood that feeling completely, the way a place could either nag at you or settle you, and how rare the settling kind was. "I should get on," Marshall said, swinging back up onto the mare with the easy, unhurried motion of someone who had done it 10,000 times. "Good evening, Miss Pritchard." "Good evening, Mr. Rourke," she said. "Enjoy your rope." He looked down at her, and that brief, warm smile came back. "It's already proving very useful," he said, and rode off into the darkening evening. Dorothy went inside and made herself supper and thought about dark eyes, and how some people showed you exactly who they were right from the beginning if you were paying attention. The weeks settled into a rhythm that Dorothy found deeply satisfying. She taught 5 days a week, and spent her evenings preparing lessons and her weekends visiting families, because she had decided that the best way to keep children in school was to make herself known to the people who held power over whether those children attended. She had now spoken to all 23 families in the immediate area who had school-aged children, and enrollment had crept up to 22 students, which was nearly everyone. The holdout was a rancher named Hector Grimes who had 5 children, and a philosophy about education that Dorothy found both ignorant and enraging. But she smiled at him pleasantly every time she saw him, and she was playing a long game. She saw Marshall Rourke more often than she would have predicted, given that he worked a ranch 6 miles south. He came into town for supplies with a regularity that suggested the Dunbar spread required an unusual quantity of flour and hardware. He always stopped to talk to her when he saw her, in the way that felt natural and unplanned, the way you stop to talk to someone when you want to talk to them, and have not yet found a formal reason to do so. He helped her one Saturday in late July when she was attempting to haul a heavy crate of books that a church in Wichita had donated, books that had arrived at the stage depot and needed to be moved to the schoolhouse. She was in the process of determining whether she could manage the crate on a borrowed cart when Marshall appeared beside her, took one look at the situation, and said, "Let me get the other end." They carried it together, which was easier and which also required them to walk side by side, and she noticed that he adjusted his stride to match hers without being asked, which was a small thing that told her something important about the quality of his attention. "You read much?" she asked as they set the crate down on the schoolhouse porch. "Some," he said. "I'm not fast at it. Nobody pushed me hard when I was young." He said it without self-pity, as a simple piece of information. "What do you like to read when you do?" He thought about it seriously. "Maps," he said, "and anything that explains how things work, mechanical things." "I borrowed a book from the Dunbar Library about steam engines once and read it 3 times. Dorothy smiled at that. "You like understanding systems," she said. He looked at her with the slight surprise of someone who has just been seen clearly. "I suppose I do," he said. "I never thought of it that way." "What do you like to do?" she asked. "Besides ride and work." "Carve," he said. "Wood. Nothing fancy, just small things. It's something to do with your hands in the evenings." She looked at his hands without meaning to make it obvious, large and scarred and capable, and looked away. "I'd like to see something you've made sometime," she said. "I'll bring something," he said simply, as though that was already settled, and helped her pull the nails off the crate lid so she could start sorting the books. He stayed for 2 hours, sorting and shelving beside her, and they talked about Kansas and Illinois and what they each thought made a good life. And by the time he rode south in the late afternoon, Dorothy was sitting among stacked books feeling as though she had been turned slightly on her axis, the way the world looks different after a significant conversation, as though some adjustment has been made to the angle of light. It was in August, 6 weeks after she had arrived, that the trouble with the Grimes family came to a head. Dorothy had been making slow progress with Hector Grimes, and in late July his wife, a thin, exhausted woman named Nora, had sent the 2 eldest children to school for 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks had been wonderful. The older girl, Patience, was 15 and had a gift for language that took Dorothy's breath away, and the boy Thomas, 13, was a methodical thinker who approached problems like an engineer. Then one Monday morning they simply stopped appearing, and when Dorothy rode out to the Grimes property on a borrowed horse, she found Nora Grimes at the fence line looking wretched, and Hector Grimes in the yard with his arms crossed and his jaw set. "My children aren't going to that school anymore," he said. "I need them on the land." "Mr. Grimes," Dorothy said, keeping her voice even, "your daughter Patience has a remarkable mind. She is reading at a level that I rarely see in adults. To remove her from education now would be my business," Hector Grimes said. "This is my land and my family, and you can take yourself back to town." Dorothy looked at Nora Grimes, who looked at the ground. She rode back to town with her jaw aching from keeping it still. She knew the limits of what she could do. There was no compulsory attendance law in Kansas in 1879, and Hector Grimes had the legal right to keep his children home. She went back to her cottage and sat at her table and felt, for the first time since arriving, the specific frustration of hitting a wall that education and determination and politeness could not get over. She heard boots on her porch and then a knock, and when she opened the door, Marshall Rourke was standing there holding a small carved wooden horse. It was beautifully made, maybe 4 inches long, the grain of the wood used cleverly to suggest movement, the legs caught in mid-stride. "I told you I'd bring something," he said. Then he looked at her face. "What happened?" She told him about Hector Grimes, standing in her doorway because she had not yet thought to invite him in, and as she talked she felt the frustration come through in her voice, the helpless anger at watching something needless happen to two children who had not asked for the father they had. Marshall listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "Can I come in?" She stepped back. He sat at her table and turned the little carved horse over in his hands as he thought, and she put the kettle on the stove because that was something to do while she was thinking, too. "Grimes owes the Dunbar spread a considerable sum," Marshall said finally. "He bought cattle on credit 2 years ago and the payment's been slow. Mr. Dunbar has been patient about it, but it's a real debt." Dorothy looked at him. "I'm not sure what that has to do with the children." "Probably nothing," Marshall said, "but I see Dunbar every day. I could mention, just as conversation, that Grimes's children are doing remarkably well in school. Dunbar is on the town council. He sets some store by education. He funded the schoolhouse library, actually, a few years back." Dorothy was quiet for a moment, parsing the shape of what he was suggesting. "You think Mr. Dunbar might speak to Grimes?" "I think if Dunbar said to Grimes that he'd look favorably on a man who made sure his children were educated, Grimes would find a way to make it work," Marshall said. He looked up at her. "It's not a perfect solution. The children should go to school because Grimes wants them to have good lives, not because his creditor prefers it. But the children would go to school." Dorothy thought about Patience Grimes, her quick dark eyes, and the way she had devoured every book Dorothy put in front of her. She thought about Thomas working through a mathematics problem with quiet, focused intensity. She thought about what her father used to say, that the right outcome sometimes required working with the material available, not the material you wished you had. "Would you do that?" she asked. "Speak to Dunbar." "I was planning on it tomorrow morning," Marshall said. She looked at him and felt something move behind her sternum, a warm and particular feeling that she recognized and was not quite ready to name yet. "Thank you," she said. He shrugged, but not dismissively. "It's worth doing," he said. He set the little carved horse on her table. "That's for you. I thought you might want something on the shelf that wasn't a book." She picked it up and looked at it. The craftsmanship was extraordinary for someone who called it a hobby, the wood smooth and warm under her fingers, the horse's expression caught in a moment of perfect forward motion. "It's beautiful," she said, and she meant it entirely. He looked slightly self-conscious, which was the first time she had seen him look anything other than entirely comfortable in his own skin. "It's just something to do with time," he said, and stood up. "I'll let you know what Dunbar says." He was at her door when she said Marshall. She had not meant to use his first name. It had come out naturally and she did not apologize for it. He turned. "Why are you being so kind to me?" She asked because she was a direct person and she had been wondering. He held her gaze for a moment with those dark, level eyes. "Because you're doing something that matters," he said, "and because you're doing it all by yourself in a town that didn't expect you." He left, and Dorothy stood holding the little wooden horse, and the warm feeling behind her sternum did not go away. Patience and Thomas Grimes were back in school the following Thursday. Dorothy did not ask Marshall exactly what had been said. She just left a small jar of apple preserves she had made on his horse's saddle the next time she saw his mare tied outside the general store, with a note that said only, "Thank you. D.P." She came around the corner later that day to find him standing beside his horse reading the note, and when he looked up and saw her, that full, warm smile broke across his face like sunrise, sudden and complete. September arrived, and with it the first real hint of autumn on the plains, the mornings going cool and crisp, while the afternoons still held their heat, and the grasses along the creek shifting from summer green to the deep gold that would eventually become the sweeping tawny landscape of a Kansas winter. Dorothy had not expected to love the plains. She had imagined them as merely flat and empty, a nothing between more interesting places. But there was something about the scale of the sky over Kansas that she had not anticipated, the way it made everything beneath it feel simultaneously small and significant, the way the light moved across all that flat space in sweeping curtains and columns that were genuinely dramatic. She mentioned this to Marshall one evening in mid-September when he had stopped by the schoolhouse yard while she was finishing up and found her standing in the last of the day's light watching a bank of clouds build over the western horizon. He stood beside her and looked at it. "People from the east usually say it's boring," he said. "All that flatness." "They're looking at the ground," Dorothy said. "You have to look up." He glanced at her sideways. "That's exactly right," he said, and his voice had something in it that she felt rather than analyzed. They stood together watching the clouds build, and she was very aware of him beside her, the warmth of him in the cooling air, the particular gravity that some people have, the way they make the space around them feel anchored. She had not been this aware of another person in a very long time. She had, in truth, not allowed herself to be. Her father's illness had taken 3 years and consumed everything around it, including most of her social life and all of her romantic hopes, and she had gotten so used to not looking at what she wanted that she was only now beginning to remember how it felt. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Do you believe in fate?" He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she looked at him, and he was looking at the horizon with that thoughtful expression that meant he was actually considering the question rather than reaching for an easy answer. "I'm not sure about fate," he said finally. "The idea that it's all laid out, that you end up where you end up because some plan put you there." He paused. "I've seen too many good people end up in bad places through no fault of their own to believe the plan is always fair." She nodded. "So you don't believe in it?" "I didn't say that." He turned to look at her, and the light was doing something extraordinary to his face, the last of the day's sun catching the strong line of his jaw, the dark earnest of his eyes. "I believe in riding toward what matters," he said. "I believe that if you pay attention to what pulls you forward and you move toward it instead of away from it, you end up where you're supposed to be. Not because the road was already built, because you built it." Dorothy looked at him. The clouds were turning pink and purple and the air smelled like approaching rain and dry grass, and she thought that she had heard a great many things said about fate and destiny and the shape of a life, and she had never heard anything that felt quite so completely true. "That's a good answer," she said. "It's the only answer I've got," he said. "It served me well enough." She thought about what it would mean to ride toward what matters. She thought about a man who had driven out of his way repeatedly for 2 months to have conversations with a schoolteacher he barely knew. She thought about a carved wooden horse, perfect and lovely, sitting on her shelf. "I think it served you very well," she said softly. "The rain came that night and kept coming for 3 days, and the roads turned to mud and the creek ran high and yellow and wild, and Dorothy taught her classes by lamplight and the world felt close and intimate the way it does when rain keeps you in." On the second day of rain, Marshall appeared at her door at noon with a covered pot and the slightly embarrassed expression of a man who has done something he is not sure will be welcome. The pot contained venison stew. "I was in town on an errand and I thought," he started. "Come in," Dorothy said. "I have bread." They ate together at her small table, and the rain hammered the roof and the stove was warm, and they talked for 3 hours. They talked about books, which it turned out he had read more of than he let on, and about music, which she loved and he claimed to be indifferent to until she got him talking about it, and he admitted to finding something deeply moving about fiddle music played around a fire, the way it could make you feel sad and happy at the same time, and didn't seem to require you to choose between the two. She told him about her father and the long years of illness and what it had cost her, and how she had come through it with a very clear and somewhat brutal sense of what mattered and what did not. He told her about growing up poor in South Texas, the third of 5 boys, his father a cattle drover who was gone more than he was home, his mother a woman of considerable practical intelligence who had taught all 5 of her sons to cook, to sew, and to think carefully before speaking. "She sounds remarkable," Dorothy said. "She was," he said. "She died when I was 16, childbirth the baby too." His voice was even, but she could hear the shape of old grief in it, the way it had been worked over and worn smooth by time without ever quite disappearing. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it the way that only people who have lost someone they loved can mean it, not as a social formula, but as a genuine acknowledgement of a real wound. "Thank you," he said, and looked at her. And in the lamplight with the rain coming down outside, he looked at her in a way that was so direct and unguarded that she felt her breath change. She was the one who looked away first, which surprised her. He left when the rain slowed in the late afternoon, and she stood at the door and watched him ride off through the mud toward the south, his duster dark with rain. And she went back inside and sat down and had a very honest conversation with herself about what was happening. What was happening was that she was falling in love with Marshall Rourke, and she had been falling for several weeks, and she had been trying not to notice because she was a practical woman and she was newly employed and she had not come to Kansas for a man. She had come for a life. But the falling was happening regardless, with the patient inevitability of water finding its level, and she had a choice about whether to be honest about that or to keep pretending she didn't know what she knew. She looked at the carved horse on her shelf. She thought about a man who believed in riding toward what matters. She made her decision. The following Saturday she went to the Dunbar Ranch. She had a genuine reason for going, which was that she wanted to thank Franklin Dunbar personally for the donation of books to the schoolhouse library, and to ask whether he might have additional volumes he could spare. She was not inventing this reason. It was real. But it was also not entirely the point of the visit. Marshall was in the yard when she rode up, working with another hand on a section of fence that needed repair. He saw her coming and straightened, and even at a distance she could see the surprise and then the pleasure move across his face. Franklin Dunbar was a tall man in his 60s, lean and sun-darkened and very sharp behind the eyes, the kind of man who had built something real and knew exactly what it had cost him. He received Dorothy graciously, showed her into a parlor that was remarkably well appointed for a working ranch, and listened with genuine interest as she talked about the school. He did have more books, several crates of them that had belonged to his late wife and had not been opened in years, and he was glad to donate them. After the business was done, he offered her coffee and she accepted, and they sat for a while talking about Caldwell and about Kansas, and about what he thought the territory would look like in another 20 years. He had strong opinions about the railroad and about cattle prices, and about the need for better water management on the plains, and Dorothy listened and asked questions, and found him genuinely interesting. At some point he said, with the directness of a man who had not accumulated 60-odd years without learning how to see things, "Marshall mentioned you several times." Dorothy kept her expression pleasant and steady. "We've spoken a few times," she said. Franklin Dunbar looked at her over his coffee cup with something that might have been amusement. "He talks about the school," he said, "and about what you're doing for the children here. But the way a man talks about a thing tells you what he's actually thinking about." Dorothy set her cup down. "Mr. Dunbar," she said, "what is Marshall Rourke like, as a man?" He considered that. "Honest," he said. "Dependable in the way that means you can put your life on it, not just your word. He works harder than he has to, and he never complains, and he's never once done anything I'd be ashamed of." He paused. He was badly let down by someone a few years back, a woman he'd planned to marry. She changed her mind and chose somebody with more money and a house in town. He went quiet after that, pulled back from people. He's only recently started seeming like himself again. Dorothy absorbed this carefully. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I'm an old man," Franklin Dunbar said. "I say what seems useful." She rode home with 3 boxes of books roped to her horse's flanks and a great deal to think about. She was almost back to town when Marshall caught up to her, riding the bay mare at an easy canter. He pulled alongside her and they rode in companionable silence for a minute. "How'd it go?" he asked. "Very well. He's donating books." She looked at him. "He thinks highly of you." "He's a good employer," Marshall said, with the carefulness of someone navigating around something. "Marshall," she said. "Miss Pritchard, "I asked him what you were like," she said. "As a man. He told me you're honest and dependable and that you were hurt a few years ago and have been closed off since." Silence. The horses moved through the dry grass along the road, and a meadowlark called somewhere off to the left, and the afternoon light was golden and heavy. "That's pretty thorough," Marshall said finally. "I thought you should know I know," she said, "because I don't want there to be things between us that I know and you don't know I know." He looked at her. "Between us," he repeated carefully. She met his gaze. "Yes." He was quiet for another moment, and then he said, "Why did you ask him what I was like?" Dorothy considered several possible answers, the evasive ones and the practical ones, and the one that was simply the truth. She chose the truth because she was her father's daughter and her father had raised her to say what was real. "Because I wanted to know," she said. "Because you matter to me and I wanted to understand you better, and you haven't told me about that part of your life yourself." The meadowlark called again. The horses walked on. "Her name was Caroline," he said at last. "She was from a good family in Wichita, and she was the prettiest woman I'd ever seen, and I was young enough to think that pretty and kind were the same thing. They're not." He said it without bitterness. "She chose the banker's son, and I went back to work, and eventually I came here." He looked at Dorothy. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me." "I know," she said. "I'm not. I'm telling you because you were honest with me," he said. "And because," he stopped. "Because," she prompted gently. He looked at her with those dark, honest eyes, and she saw him make the decision to say the thing. "Because I think about you considerably more than I should, given that we've only known each other a few months, and I've been trying to figure out what to do about that." Dorothy felt warmth rise in her chest and spread outward, the kind that comes from being seen and recognized, from the world returning something you had been quietly hoping it would return. "I think you should stop trying to figure out what to do about it," she said, "and just do it." He reined his horse to a stop, and she stopped beside him, and they faced each other in the gold afternoon light, two people on horseback in the middle of the Kansas plains with all that sky above them and all that wide, honest country around them. "Miss Pritchard," he said, "would you let me court you properly?" "Yes," she said, "and please call me Dorothy." The smile that broke across his face then was the best thing she had seen since she arrived in Kansas, including the sunsets. "Dorothy," he said, like he was testing the weight of it. "I'll call on you Sunday if that's agreeable." "It is very agreeable," she said. They rode back to town together in the easy warmth of something decided, and it felt, Dorothy thought, exactly like riding toward what matters. He came Sunday and every Sunday after that through the golden weeks of autumn, and on some Wednesdays and Fridays as well. And they walked along the creek and through the market street and sat in her cottage talking until the lamps burned low. And it was the richest thing Dorothy could remember, those conversations. The way they could go anywhere, from the serious to the absurd to the tender, without any of the stiffness that she had always found exhausting in courtship. He brought her things, not expensive things because he did not have expensive things to give, but particular things. A feather he had found that was extraordinarily long and vivid blue, from a bird he had flushed out of the creek grass and couldn't identify. A handful of flat stones from the creek bottom that had been worn to perfect smoothness. A small carving of an owl, maybe 3 inches tall, with enormous thoughtful eyes. She cooked for him when he came to her cottage. Simple things that she had learned to make well rather than elaborate things she would make badly, cornbread and beans, and roasted chicken and apple pudding. And he always ate with the appreciative sincerity of a man who had spent too many years eating trail food, and not enough time at tables with good company. In October, the school had a small crisis when the building's roof began to leak during a rainstorm, and 3 of the desks were soaked, and 1 of the books was damaged. Dorothy arrived Monday morning to find the classroom a damp mess, and she was standing in the middle of it assessing the damage when several of the fathers arrived, apparently having been organized by she was not immediately sure whom. They had shingles and nails, and the leaking section was repaired by noon. She later discovered that Marshall had ridden to 4 houses the previous evening to organize the work party. She confronted him about this in the mildest possible way. "You could have told me," she said. "I thought you'd rather have a fixed roof than a conversation about fixing it," he said. She had to acknowledge that he was not wrong. It was a Thursday in late October when she kissed him, or more precisely, when they kissed each other, the distinction being that neither of them could have said with any certainty who moved first. They had been standing on her porch at the end of an evening, and the moon was up and enormous, the kind of moon that fills the whole sky and makes the plains look like something from a dream, silver and vast and completely still. She had said something. She could not afterward recall what, and he had been looking at her in that particular way, and then the distance between them had simply closed itself. It was a very good kiss, unhurried and deliberate, the way he did most things, and when they separated he kept his hands on either side of her face for a moment and looked at her as though he was making sure she was real. "I should have done that sooner," he said. "Yes," she agreed, "you should have." And then she kissed him again to make up for the lost time. In November, a man arrived in Caldwell who made things complicated. His name was Victor Aldine, and he had come from Wichita as the newly appointed county education supervisor, a title that apparently came with the authority to evaluate local schools and recommend whether they should continue operating. He was a thin, angular man in his mid-40s, with a suit that was too good for Kansas and opinions that were too confident for someone who had been in the territory less than a week. He visited the school on his third day in town and spent an hour observing Dorothy's class and walking through the building and looking at the books and making notes in a leather-bound pad with the focused, pursed-lip intensity of someone who has decided to find problems. Afterward, he called Dorothy into the schoolhouse after the children had gone home and told her, with the careful condescension of someone who considers this a kindness, that he found several areas of concern. The curriculum was unconventional. The mixing of age groups was irregular, and the school, while adequate, was not meeting the standards he was in the process of establishing for the county. "What standards?" Dorothy asked pleasantly. Victor Aldine named several standards which appeared to have been invented that week and wrote down in his leather pad. "And if a school does not meet these standards?" she asked. "The county has the authority to withdraw its funding," he said, "and to recommend closure to the state board." Dorothy thanked him for his visit and showed him out, and then stood in the empty schoolhouse looking at the rows of desks and the books on the shelves and the children's work pinned to the wall. Eli Dobbs's extraordinary geometric drawings and Patience Grimes's essay about the creek in autumn, which had made Dorothy's throat tighten when she graded it. It was that fine. She went to Marshall that evening. She did not go to cry on his shoulder. She went because he was the person she thought best with, the person who made her mind sharper rather than softer, and she needed to think. He listened to everything, and then he leaned back in his chair and said, "What's he actually after? Is it about the school or is it about something else?" Dorothy had been thinking about this. "Aldous Fenn mentioned at the last board meeting that there's been some discussion of bringing in a teacher from the county's preferred list," she said. "Someone they approve rather than someone who came independently." Marshall's expression went quiet and level. "So it's politics." "It often is," she said. "What do you need?" he asked. She looked at him. "I need the parents on my side. If the families want me here and say so loudly, it becomes much harder to remove me. Aldine can express concerns, but he can't override a town that's unified." "Then let's make sure the town is unified," Marshall said, and the calm certainty with which he said it, not arrogant, just utterly committed, made her feel something she recognized now as completely, fundamentally hers to feel. Love. She said, "I love you," because it was true and because she was someone who said things that were true when they needed saying. Marshall went very still. Then he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, open and vulnerable and completely unguarded, all the careful steadiness stripped away to reveal the man underneath it, who was somewhat overwhelmed. "Dorothy," he said, and his voice was rough at the edges. "You don't have to say it back right now," she said. "I just needed you to know. "I love you," he said. "I have for a while, he stopped. I wanted to be sure I could give you something real before I said it." "You already have," she said. "You've been giving me something real for months." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned hers over and held his, and they sat like that for a while, just breathing, and it was one of the most intimate things she had ever experienced, the simple weight and warmth of being held by someone who loved you and meant it. The campaign to protect the school was swift and effective. Marshall spoke to the fathers he knew, Dorothy spoke to the mothers. Franklin Dunbar wrote a letter to the county board that was clear and authoritative. And Eli Dobbs's father, in a surprising reversal, came to the board meeting and said that his son had learned more in 2 months with Miss Pritchard than in the 2 years before, and that he wanted to know who had the authority to close the school because he had some words for them. Victor Aldine left Caldwell in the second week of November with his leather-bound pad and his pressed suit, and a notably smaller sense of authority than he'd arrived with. The county withdrew the threat of oversight. Dorothy received a letter from the state board, acknowledging the school's continued good standing and offering a small increase in funding. She celebrated by making the best apple cake she had ever made and bringing it to the Dunbar Ranch, where she shared it with Marshall and Franklin Dunbar, and 3 other hands who happened to be there, and who ate their portions with the reverent appreciation of men who had not had good cake in a very long time. Franklin Dunbar watched her, and Marshall across the table, with the quiet, satisfied expression of someone who has been right about something. December came in cold and bright, the plains turning to iron and gold, the sky a thin, perfect blue that seemed to go up forever. Dorothy loved winter on the plains, which surprised her. There was a beauty to the starkness, a clarity to the cold air that made everything look razor-edged and precise. And the snow, when it came in mid-December, transformed the world into something so simple and perfect that she stood at the schoolhouse window for a long time just looking at it. The school broke for the Christmas holiday on the 22nd, and Dorothy's cottage was warm and smelled of pine branches she had cut from the trees along the creek and arranged above the windows. And she had made presents for her students, small things, a bookmark, a pencil case she had sewn, a piece of horehound candy wrapped in paper, and she had given them out on the last day with the satisfaction of someone who has spent a year making something worth having. Marshall came to her on Christmas Eve with his hat in his hands, and a look on his face that she recognized as the look of a man who had made a decision and was about to act on it. She had made soup, and there was bread, and the stove was warm, and the pine branches smelled of winter and health, and they had eaten and were sitting close together on the small settee she had acquired from a departing family, comfortable and warm, and he reached into his coat pocket and brought out a small carved box. The box was extraordinary, her initials carved into the lid in a flowing, intricate pattern, the wood a warm reddish-brown she didn't know the name of. Inside it, on a small square of cloth, was a ring, a simple one, a polished silver band with a tiny garnet set in it. "I've been making the box since September," he said. "The ring I got in Wichita last month." He looked at her. "I want to marry you, Dorothy. I want to build something with you here or somewhere else, wherever you want to build it. I want to spend my life talking to you and working beside you, and I want to be the man that you have when things are hard." He paused. "I know I'm a ranch hand and I don't have much, and there are men in this town who could offer you more in terms of—" "Marshall," she said. "Yes." "Stop listing reasons I might say no," she said. "I'm going to say yes." He looked at her, and that expression, open and overwhelmed and grateful, the one she had first seen the night she told him she loved him, spread across his face like the sun coming out. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said. "Of course, yes. You are the best man I know, and I want to spend my life talking to you too, and I think we will be very good together, and I would be honored to marry you." He put the ring on her finger with slightly unsteady hands, and she kissed him, and outside the snow came down soft and steady over the Kansas plains, covering everything in white. They were married in March of 1880, on a Saturday afternoon with the first warm breath of spring in the air, in the small white church on Caldwell's Main Street. Franklin Dunbar attended and sat in the front row with the proprietary satisfaction of someone who considers himself personally responsible for the whole thing. Walt Briggs from the general store came, and Clara Dobbs came with her children, and Eli Dobbs in his Sunday best looked at everything with solemn, attentive eyes. Patience Grimes was there, and her expression when she watched the ceremony was complicated and wondering, the expression of a young woman who is understanding something for the first time about what life might hold. Dorothy wore a dress she had made herself over the winter, dark blue wool with cream lace at the collar and cuffs, and she carried a bunch of dried prairie wildflowers she had saved from the fall because there were no fresh flowers in Kansas in March, and she found that fitting, that she should carry something that had survived the winter and was still worth holding. Marshall stood at the front of the church in a clean white shirt and a dark coat that she had helped him brush and press the night before, and when she walked down the aisle, he looked at her the way he always looked at her, directly and completely, as though she was the most interesting and essential thing in his field of view, and she thought that she had never in her life felt so entirely known. The minister read the words and they said the words back, and Marshall's voice was steady and his eyes never moved from hers, and when the minister said he could kiss his bride he did so with the warm, unhurried certainty that characterized everything he did, and the church made the noise that churches make at those moments, soft and pleased. Afterward there was a gathering at the Dunbar Ranch because Franklin Dunbar had insisted on hosting it, and nobody argued with Franklin Dunbar when he insisted on things. There was food and music, a fiddle player named Gus who played exactly the kind of music Marshall had described, the kind that made you feel sad and happy at the same time without requiring you to choose, and Dorothy danced with her husband on the packed earth of the ranch yard in the March light, and she thought, this is what riding toward what matters gets you. This is where the road goes. They moved into a proper house that spring. Marshall had been talking to Franklin Dunbar through the winter, and what had come of those conversations was an agreement that Marshall would take on the role of foreman of the Dunbar spread, a position that came with a house, a small one, 2 rooms and a porch, but solid and weather-tight in theirs. It stood about a quarter-mile from the main ranch house, sheltered by a stand of cottonwood trees that would be magnificent in summer. Dorothy continued to teach. There was never a question about this. Marshall would not have raised the question, and she would not have accepted it if he had. The school was hers as much as it was anyone's, and the children needed her, and teaching was what she did. She rode to Caldwell 5 days a week on a gray horse Marshall had helped her choose, a steady, sensible animal she named Clover, and she came home in the evenings to a house that was warm because Marshall came in from the range and built the fire before she arrived, a small domestic kindness that she never stopped noticing. Their life had the quality she had imagined when she thought about what a life well lived might feel like, purposeful and warm and occasionally difficult and consistently rich. Marshall was not an easy man in the sense of being uncomplicated. He was quiet in ways that could be hard to read, and he had opinions about certain things that were quite fixed, and there were nights when old unhappiness visited him in the dark, the particular grief of a man who had lost people and spent years being careful not to lose more. But he was honest about all of it, which she had come to understand was the rarest and most important quality in a person. He did not pretend. He did not perform ease or perform happiness. When he was difficult, he said so, and when he was grieving, he said so, and when he was happy, it was because he was actually happy, and she could trust every single thing she saw in his face. She was, she thought, on a September evening in 1880, 6 months into their marriage, possibly the happiest she had ever been. She was sitting on the porch of their small house in the warm end-of-summer evening, watching a storm build on the western horizon the way storms did here, with epic, theatrical slowness, and she had a cup of tea and the sound of Marshall moving around in the kitchen behind her, and Clover was visible in the corral, shifting lazily from one foot to the other, and the world felt exactly the right size. Marshall came out with his own cup and sat beside her on the porch steps, close enough that his shoulder was against hers, and they watched the storm build together in companionable, rich silence. "I have something to tell you," Dorothy said. He looked at her. "We're going to have a baby," she said. The silence lasted for perhaps 3 seconds, and then Marshall put his cup down very carefully and turned to look at her with an expression she had never seen before on his face. Something so completely unguarded that it was almost overwhelming to witness. Joy and fear and wonder all at once. A man who had spent years building careful walls around himself, suddenly having no walls at all. "Dorothy," he said. "Yes," she confirmed. "Spring, I think, maybe April." He took both her hands in his and held them and looked at her, and the storm kept building over the flat western horizon, and the cottonwoods moved in the rising wind, and he said, very quietly, "I didn't know it was possible to want something this much." "I know," she said. "I didn't either." He kissed her hands, both of them, one and then the other, and they sat on the porch as the storm came in, and the first drops of rain began to fall, and the world was entirely, perfectly, exactly right. The pregnancy was not entirely easy. Dorothy was sick through November and into December, not devastatingly so but consistently, and she kept teaching through all of it, which Marshall worried about and which she was firm about. She had more energy in the afternoons than the mornings, so she organized her most demanding lessons for afternoon, and she ate crackers at her desk before school started, and she managed. The children knew she was expecting, because Caldwell was a small town and small towns knew everything, and they were peculiarly sweet about it, bringing her wildflowers even in December, the dried and preserved ones that still grew along the sheltered creek banks, and drawing her pictures and being slightly more careful and attentive than they might otherwise have been. Eli Dobbs, who was 15 now and reading at a level that continued to astonish her, brought her a book one afternoon that he had found at a church sale, a worn copy of a collected Shakespeare, and presented it to her with the slightly awkward sincerity of a teenage boy doing something he is very sure about but not quite sure how to carry off. "I thought the baby might like to hear you read," he said. Dorothy looked at the book and then at the boy, this serious, extraordinary young man who had been hidden inside a difficult family situation until she had found him, and she felt the fullness of what teaching meant, the particular long-game beauty of it. "Thank you, Eli," she said. "I'll read from it every evening." She did, and Marshall listened while he worked at the table or sat in the chair beside the stove, and sometimes he would ask her to read a passage again, and she would, and the winter evenings had a quality that she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. The baby came in early April, which was exactly when she had expected, which Dorothy took as confirmation that she was right about most things. It was a boy, born on a windy Monday morning with Marshall nearby, and a midwife named Hattie who had delivered probably 100 babies in Caldwell County, and moved through the work with brisk, competent calm. The labor was long but not dangerous, and when it was over and the baby was in her arms, red and demanding and perfect, she looked at Marshall, who was standing at the edge of the room with the expression of a man who has just been unmade and remade simultaneously. "Come here," she said. He came and sat beside her on the bed, and she put the baby in his arms and watched Marshall Rourke hold his son for the first time. His hands were careful and enormous around the tiny body, and his face was completely undone, and he said nothing for a very long time, just looked. "Hello," he said finally, very quietly to the baby. The baby made a small, indignant sound. "I know," Marshall said. "I completely agree." Dorothy laughed, tired and overjoyed, and leaned her head against his shoulder, and the Kansas wind swept around the little house in the cottonwoods, and the world went on, larger and richer and more full of possibility than it had been the day before. They named him Thomas after Dorothy's father. Thomas William Rourke, born April 4, 1881, in a house that smelled of wood smoke and spring rain and everything they had built together. The summer of 1881 was a good one by Kansas standards, which meant it was hot and occasionally dramatic and punctuated by the kind of thunderstorms that made you understand why people developed very strong feelings about weather when they lived on the plains. Dorothy went back to teaching in September when Thomas was 5 months old, and Clara Dobbs, who had become a genuine friend over the years, looked after the baby on school days, an arrangement that worked beautifully and that Dorothy suspected was as good for Clara, who needed purpose outside her difficult domestic situation, as it was for anyone. Hector Grimes had mellowed considerably. Dorothy was not entirely sure what had caused this, whether it was Franklin Dunbar's influence, or Nora's quiet persistence, or simply the grinding passage of time that wears down even the most stubborn positions. But by the spring of 1881 he had enrolled all 5 of his children in school, including his daughters, without condition or complaint. Patience Grimes was 17 now, and had an appetite for learning that kept Dorothy constantly searching for more difficult material. She had written to a women's college in the East, not with any very firm expectation of result, but because Patience deserved to have someone try. Marshall continued to run the Dunbar Ranch with the quiet, absolute competence that made him invaluable to Franklin Dunbar, and well regarded by everyone in the area who relied on the land for their living. He was fair to the men who worked under him, demanding but not harsh, and the ranch operated with a smoothness that reflected the kind of leadership that doesn't need to announce itself. He was home every evening, and he never once made Dorothy feel that her work was less important than his, which she knew was not universal in 1881, and which she valued accordingly. They had a particular ritual of walking together in the evenings when the weather allowed, sometimes with Thomas in a sling against Dorothy's chest, sometimes with Marshall carrying him on his shoulders when the boy was old enough, and found this arrangement entirely delightful. They would walk along the creek or out onto the open plain to watch the sunset and talk about the day, and it was in these walks, she thought, that she understood him most completely. Marshall Rourke with his sleeves rolled up and his hat pushed back, and his dark eyes scanning the horizon the way they always did, and everything he loved within reach. In the winter of 1882, a letter arrived from the Eastern Women's College. They could not offer Patience Grimes formal enrollment, as they did not have provisions at that time for Western correspondence students, but the administrator who had read Dorothy's letter about the girl had been sufficiently impressed that she enclosed an offer of a correspondence course, materials sent by post, with a certificate upon completion. It was not everything Dorothy had hoped for, but it was something. She rode out to the Grimes property herself to give Patience the letter, and watched the girl read it sitting at the kitchen table while Nora Grimes hovered at the stove and tried not to visibly hope too hard. When Patience looked up, her eyes were bright and she was holding the letter very carefully, as though it might dissolve. "Does this mean I can keep studying?" she asked. "It means exactly that," Dorothy said. Patience reached across the table and took Dorothy's hand and held it for a moment, too moved for words, which was unusual for a girl who was almost never without them. Then she released it and straightened and started reading the letter again with the focused attention of someone beginning the next section of work. Nora Grimes caught Dorothy's eye over her daughter's bent head, and her expression said everything that she did not say aloud, all of it, the years of hoping, and the difficulty of hoping inside a hard life, and the enormous, sustaining relief of seeing your child given a door that leads somewhere. Dorothy rode home in the cold February afternoon with her heart very full. That spring, Franklin Dunbar announced that he was planning to retire, which in his case meant that he was thinking about spending somewhat less time on horseback and somewhat more time sitting on his porch, reading the books his late wife had collected. He called Marshall into his office one day in April and told him that he wanted to sell him a parcel of the ranch, 50 acres along the creek with the little house and the cottonwoods, at a price that was favorable to the point of being, as Marshall later told Dorothy, practically a gift. Why? Marshall asked him directly, because that was how he asked things. Because you built this place into what it is, Franklin Dunbar said. And because you and your wife are what this county needs, and I want you to have roots deep enough to stay. Marshall came home that evening and told Dorothy about the conversation and the price, and they sat at the kitchen table with Thomas asleep in the next room, and went through the figures together with the methodical seriousness of people who had learned not to make decisions on the basis of feeling alone, but who were also not going to ignore what they felt. They could do it. It would take most of their savings and it would mean careful years ahead, but they could do it, and what they would have at the end of it was land. Their land. Something that could not be taken by a departed employer or a town council's change of heart, or any of the other instabilities that Dorothy had moved through on her way to this kitchen table. Yes, Dorothy said. Yes, Marshall agreed. They shook hands across the table, which made both of them laugh, and then Marshall reached across and took her hand properly, laced his fingers through hers, and squeezed once, which was the particular gesture that meant everything between them that was too large to say directly. The transfer was completed in June of 1882, and the 50 acres along the creek became the Rourke property. Marshall continued to work the broader Dunbar Ranch in his foreman capacity, because Franklin Dunbar's retirement was gradual and he still needed the management. But in the evenings and on Saturdays, Marshall worked his own land with a focus and a satisfaction that Dorothy recognized as a man becoming fully himself. He began building that summer. Not new rooms yet, those would come later, but infrastructure. A proper barn, a better corral, raised garden beds that Dorothy wanted along the south side of the house. He worked with methodical, patient purpose, and sometimes she would sit on the porch in the long summer evenings with Thomas on her lap, watching Marshall work in the field, and she thought about Illinois and the stagecoach, and the moment she had stepped off into the dust of Caldwell without a job, and without anyone expecting her. And the distance between that moment and this one was the most astonishing thing she had ever considered. Thomas walked at 11 months and began talking at 13, which Dorothy took as evidence of superior intelligence, and Marshall took as evidence that he was never going to have a quiet evening again. The boy was extraordinarily social, greeting everyone who came to the house with the uninhibited confidence of someone who has never been given a reason to doubt that people will like him, which was something Marshall watched with a complicated expression, recognizing something in his son that he had taken much longer to find in himself. By the fall of 1882, with Thomas toddling around the house and the land taking shape and the school in its 4th year of solid, growing operation, Dorothy looked at her life with the clear-eyed assessment that was her habit, and arrived at a conclusion that she shared with Marshall on a Thursday evening while they were doing the dishes, which was the time they had the most honest conversations, side by side with their hands busy and no particular ceremony around what got said. "I think this is the life I was hoping for," she said. Marshall was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "What were you hoping for exactly? When you left Illinois," she thought about it. "Something real," she said. "Something where what I did mattered. Something that used all of me, not just the polite parts." He handed her a plate to dry, and I wanted not to be alone," she said, "though I wouldn't have admitted that part very readily." "Why not?" "Because admitting you want something makes you vulnerable to not getting it," she said. "And I had spent 3 years not getting things I wanted. I was cautious." Marshall leaned back against the counter and looked at her. "You didn't seem cautious when you walked into Aldous Fenn's barber shop and told him the job was yours." She smiled. "That's different. That was just logic. Being vulnerable about wanting love is a different kind of exposure." She looked at him. "You know that." He looked back at her steadily. "I do," he said. "I was cautious too, longer than you." He paused. "But you rode toward it anyway." She thought about that September evening, the clouds building, the grass gold, the meadowlark calling, and her own voice saying, "Do you believe in fate?" "So did you," she said. "So did we," he agreed. He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and the lamp burned warm, and the night came down over the Kansas plains. And Thomas made small sleeping sounds from the next room, and the cottonwood trees stood in their still silver rows outside the window, and the world was closed and right and full. Patience Grimes completed her correspondence course in the spring of 1883 and received her certificate, which was, in the context of the Kansas plains in 1883, a genuinely remarkable achievement. Dorothy organized a small gathering at the schoolhouse to mark the occasion, to which Patience's family came, including, unexpectedly, Hector Grimes, who sat in the back with his arms crossed and his face working through emotions it was not accustomed to navigating, and who, when it was over, put his hand on his daughter's shoulder and said, gruffly and with visible difficulty, "I'm proud of you, girl," which made Nora Grimes cry and Patience stand very straight, and Dorothy have to look at the wall for a moment to compose herself. Eli Dobbs, 18 now, had been accepted by a surveying company in Wichita as a junior apprentice, a position that Dorothy had helped him apply for after writing him a letter of recommendation that she considered to be one of the finest pieces of professional correspondence she had ever composed. He came to say goodbye to Dorothy on his last day in Caldwell, formal and moved, and she shook his hand and told him that he was going to do extraordinary things, which she entirely believed, and he nodded with the serious, attentive expression he had always had, and rode north toward his future. That same spring, Dorothy discovered she was pregnant again. Thomas was too, sturdy and voluble and deeply interested in everything, particularly the horses. The second pregnancy was easier, which surprised her and pleased her, and she taught through it again without particular difficulty. Marshall was less anxious this time, though still attentive in the particular way he had, noticing when she was tired before she said so, appearing at the schoolhouse on Friday afternoons to ride home with her through the winter because he worried about the roads. The second baby arrived in September of 1883 on a warm, golden afternoon, and she was a girl this time, small and serious-eyed and possessed, from her very first hours of life, of the particular watchful quality of someone who intends to understand everything going on around her. They named her Clara, after Clara Dobbs, who had looked after Thomas through all those school days and who cried in an entirely undignified way when she heard about the name, and said that it was too good a thing and Dorothy shouldn't have. Dorothy absolutely should have and entirely intended to. Thomas met his sister with the intense, puzzled interest of a 2-year-old who has been told something is coming and now has to reconcile the information with the reality, circled the basket she was sleeping in twice, and then announced to Marshall with complete confidence that he was going to teach her about horses. Marshall looked at Dorothy over the boy's head with an expression she recognized as the undone and remade one, the one he got when joy was simply too large to manage quietly, and she smiled at him and he smiled back, and between them in the lamplight were their 2 children, and their house, and their 50 acres along the creek, and the life they had ridden toward. By 1884, the Rourke place had 2 more rooms added to it, a proper bedroom for Thomas and a sleeping room for Clara, and a larger kitchen that Dorothy had insisted on because she was a good cook, and she did not see why good cooking should be done in inconvenient spaces. The garden that Marshall had built for her along the south wall produced more food than they could eat alone, and Dorothy had taken to bringing preserves to families who were going through hard times, which in cattle country in the 1880s was a rotating reality. The land had the particular settled look of a place that has been cared for, the barn standing solid and dark red against the sky, the corral clean and properly fenced, the cottonwoods enormous now in summer, throwing shade across the yard in long moving pools. Marshall bought 2 of his own cattle that year, a modest beginning of a small herd, and he and Thomas spent a Sunday afternoon watching them settle into the pasture with a shared gravity that Dorothy found hilarious and touching in equal measure. A full-grown man and a 3-year-old boy evaluating cattle with identical expressions of focused assessment. The school grew. By 1884, it had 31 students and had outgrown its original space, and Dorothy had been making arguments to the board for a larger building for 2 years. The argument was finally won in the spring of 1884 when the county allocated funds for expansion, which Dorothy understood to be partly the result of her persistent advocacy, partly Franklin Dunbar's influence on the county board, and partly the simple pressure of 31 children sitting in a space designed for 20. The expansion was completed by August. 2 new rooms and a small library space that finally had proper shelving for the books, all the donations and purchases accumulated over 5 years. Dorothy stood in the new library on the Saturday before the fall term began and looked at the shelves and thought of Gerald Hatch, dead before she arrived, who had placed an advertisement in the Springfield Courier, and thereby changed the entire course of her life without knowing he was doing it. She hoped, wherever he was, that he knew how it had turned out. She was still standing there when Marshall appeared in the doorway, carrying Clara on his hip because Clara, at 11 months, was insisting on being vertical at all hours, and Thomas was behind him, already moving toward the shelves with the intent expression of a child who has learned to read and now regards books as personal property. "Careful with the books," Dorothy said. "I know," Thomas said with dignity. Marshall leaned against the door frame and looked at her. "You did this," he said. "The county funded it," she said. "The county funded it because of 5 years of you," he said. "Don't be modest about the things you've earned." She looked at him. Clara was patting his jaw with a determined hand, and he turned his head briefly to give her his attention, a natural, easy gesture, and then looked back at Dorothy. "I'm not modest," Dorothy said. "I just believe in accurate attribution." She looked around the library. "I'll take credit for the shelving system. I designed it myself." He laughed, full and warm, the laugh that she had been hearing for 5 years, and that still had the ability to make her feel like the world was a fundamentally generous place. She crossed the room and kissed him, which made Clara laugh because Clara found kissing funny, and Thomas made a sound of theatrical disgust because at 4 years old he found it incomprehensible. "Come on," Dorothy said. "Let's go home." They walked out into the August afternoon, the 4 of them, into the big Kansas light that went on forever in every direction. And Dorothy held Clara's hand as she toddled along the path, and Marshall walked beside her with Thomas on his shoulders and one hand touching the small of her back. That steady, warm weight that she had stopped noticing as remarkable because it was simply always there. And it was. The fall of 1884 was the 5th anniversary of Dorothy's arrival in Caldwell, a fact she had noted privately without making ceremony of it. But Marshall had noted it too, apparently, because on the Saturday closest to the date, he saddled both horses and arranged for Franklin Dunbar to watch the children, which in the old man's current state of domestic contentment he was delighted to do, and rode with Dorothy out to the spot where the road from the stage depot crossed the eastern edge of the county, the last place you would pass before arriving in Caldwell. They stopped there in the warm October noon, horses standing quiet, the plains stretching in every direction in their deep autumn gold. "5 years ago," Marshall said, "you stepped off a stage about 2 miles from here with a trunk and a carpet bag and a job that didn't exist anymore." "And crackers," she said. "Let's not forget the crackers. They were crucial," he grinned. "And crackers, and you walked into Fenn's back room and made the job exist by sheer force of will." "Logic," she corrected. "Force of logic." "And I saw you sitting on Walt's porch reading a newspaper," he said, "and I thought, who on earth is this woman?" Dorothy looked at him. "What did you think?" she asked. "When you first saw me, really?" He considered it the way he considered everything, seriously and without rushing. "I thought you looked like someone who had come a long way and was not going to be stopped by the fact that it hadn't worked out yet," he said. I thought you looked like someone with a plan." He paused. "I thought you were the most interesting person I'd seen in a long time." "I thought you were very tall," she said. He looked at her. "And very direct," she added. "And kind in a way that didn't call attention to itself." She looked at the horizon, the rolling gold grass, the enormous sky. "I thought I would like to know you better. And now," he said. She turned to look at him, this man who had ridden toward her and kept riding, who had fixed roofs and organized book crates and spoken to landlords on her behalf, who had told her the truth about his own hurt and listened to hers, who had held their son for the first time with shaking hands, and who carved small things in the evenings by lamplight with the patient, artisan focus he brought to everything that mattered to him. "Now I know you completely," she said, "and it's better than I thought it would be. And I thought it would be very good." Marshall looked at her for a long moment, and then he reached over from his horse and took her hand, and they sat there on the edge of the road where it all began, holding hands in the October light, the horses patient beneath them, the world enormous and still and full. "I love you," he said. "I love you," she said. They rode back to their land, to their house, to their children who were currently terrorizing Franklin Dunbar with a level of energy that they came by honestly from both sides. They rode at an easy pace through the afternoon, not rushing, letting the horses pick their way through the dry grass, and the sky went from blue to that particular shade of violet and rose that Dorothy had stopped being able to describe adequately because there were not words for it. You had to see it. You had to be standing under it. Their house appeared through the cottonwoods, lit golden from within, smoke coming from the chimney, because the evenings were cool now. And through the window Dorothy could see the shape of Franklin Dunbar moving, probably trying to manage Thomas, who was very difficult to manage. And Clara's voice was audible from 20 yards away, a running commentary on everything she observed in the world, which was her primary mode of engagement. They rode into the yard and dismounted, and Marshall took the horses and Dorothy went inside, and the warmth and light and noise of her household surrounded her like an embrace, and she stood in the doorway of her own home for a moment and felt the weight and fullness of it. This life, this exact particular life, built piece by piece on the Kansas plains by two people who had both, in their different ways, come from loss and difficulty and had chosen, actively and repeatedly, to ride toward what mattered. Thomas launched himself at her from across the room with the full kinetic commitment of a 4-year-old who has missed his mother for 3 hours and considers this an emergency. She caught him and swung him up, and he told her at high speed and great volume everything that had happened while she was gone, which appeared to involve a snake in the yard, and a disagreement with Franklin Dunbar about whether you were allowed to eat biscuits before supper, and an important discovery about how the barn cat's tail worked. Marshall came in from the barn as the last of the light faded, and she handed Thomas to him and took Clara from Franklin Dunbar's arms, and the old man gathered his coat and his hat with the pleased, tired expression of someone who has spent an excellent afternoon and looked at the two of them with their children in their lamplit kitchen. "Good ride?" he asked. "Perfect ride," Marshall said. Franklin Dunbar nodded once, with the deep satisfaction of a man who had been right about something for 5 years and was enjoying the final confirmation of it. "Good," he said. "Good." He went out into the dark and they heard his horse move off and the yard went quiet. Marshall sat down with Thomas and Dorothy sat with Clara, and the stove was warm and the lamps were lit. And outside the Kansas night was vast and full of stars, the way it always was out here where there was nothing between you and the sky to dim them. Thomas eventually fell asleep in Marshall's lap mid-sentence, which was the way he almost always fell asleep, as though sleep was something that happened to him from the outside rather than something he chose. Marshall carried him to his room with the careful, practiced ease of a man who had done it hundreds of times, and came back and took Clara, who went down more gracefully, with her fist against her cheek and her eyes closing on whatever she had been examining with such focused interest. They sat together afterward in the quiet, Marshall in his chair and Dorothy on the small settee, and the fire was low and warm, and the house breathed around them with the particular nighttime quality of a place that is completely alive and completely at rest. "What are you thinking?" Marshall asked. "That I want to add a summer kitchen," she said. "On the east side. It would make the preserving so much easier in hot weather." He looked at her with amusement and something deeper, the warm, complete regard that she had grown entirely accustomed to and would never, she thought, stop feeling the full force of. "I'll draw up a plan this winter," he said. "You do that," she said. He reached across and she reached toward him, and they held hands across the space between them, the way they often did in the evenings, connected without having to be any closer, comfortable in the distance between two people who know each other well enough to leave each other room. The fire settled. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods in a long, whispering sound like the plains breathing. Thomas made some small sleeping sound from his room. Clara was utterly still. This was it. This was the thing. This was the life built from a stagecoach trip, and a dead employer, and a pair of crackers eaten on a general store porch. From a man who stopped to help carry a crate of books and brought soup in the rain, and carved a horse out of wood because he wanted to give her something beautiful. From two people who had each been hurt and careful and slow, and who had chosen, in the end, to ride toward what mattered. Dorothy looked at her husband in the firelight, and he looked back at her, and the story of how they had gotten here, the whole long particular story, was there between them in the look, everything it had cost and everything it had given back. And what it had given back was so much larger than what it had cost that the scale was almost too much to hold. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. The wind moved in the cottonwoods, the fire burned low, the children slept, and the night went on wide and full of stars over the Kansas plains, over the house and the barn and the new-turned earth of the garden and the cattle settling in the pasture, and the road that ran east toward where the stage came in. And the world was quiet and whole and entirely, completely, wonderfully closed.